At first glance, the Great Resignation and the Truckers' Freedom Convoy appear like polar opposites. The former displays a widespread dissatisfaction with labor, the conditions of labor, overwork, and the loss of meaning in labor, and it hasn't yet materialized into any tangible objective. The second was a direct strike by commercial workers, not for the sake of labor conditions themselves, but for the tangibly political aim of restricting state coercion. The Great Resignation started in the middle of COVID, with millions of workers in healthcare, blue collar, and retail leaving their jobs, followed by the laptop class and even venture capital analysts, all so far without indicating an intention of returning. The Truckers' Freedom Convoy came at the end of COVID as a direct demand on the state. Where the former has largely dissipated, the latter has been met with intense and, at least in Canada, unprecedented state crackdown. In the popular imagination, these two phenomena are coded as opposites of left and right, and yet they've both been described as a general strike. They are both apparently arresting the production and circulation of goods. In this video essay, we'll investigate the underlying connection between the two in terms of the global shift to post-neoliberal capital. But to do so, we'll take a step back to get in view what Marxists historically meant by the general strike, and how the general strike was bound up with the self-contradictory potentials embodied in imperialism. In contrast to the general strike of imperialism, we'll see how the entire 20th century was nothing more than a flattening of this potential and its dispersion, first through the administrative welfare state distributing the cuts of capital back to labor on the back end, and second through the global devaluation of labor that happened in what we call neoliberalism. And finally, we'll cite some post-neoliberal indications to see why the imperial monopoly capital of Rockefeller and Morgan, at the explosive birth of the Second Industrial Revolution, had more productive potential than the personalized platform capitalism of the so-called Third Industrial Revolution associated with neoliberalism. In short, we'll see why we're still living in the wake of the Second Industrial Revolution, and what this means for the bourgeois labor demands expressed both in the Great Resignation and in the Freedom Convoy. To start off, though, there's some necessary throat clearing if we are going to recover the original Marxist horizon of politics. There are four assumptions underlying the left's celebration of the Great Resignation and its rejection of the trucker convoy that need to be made explicit. All four of these assumptions follow from the absence of a socialist party, which would take the reins of imperialism and prosecute its contradictions through to socialism. All four assumptions embody the baggage inherited by the New Deal administrative state and the neoliberal austerity it came to administrate. First, the Great Resignation has been heralded by the Harvard Business Review, the Roosevelt Institute, and Jacobin magazine alike as an assertion of collective bargaining power by labor. People leaving their jobs cite abysmal working conditions and overwork. Indeed, for the past 50 years of neoliberalism, labor force participation rates declined overall. The proportional increases of blacks and women entering the workforce relative to white males did not make up for this general decline. The endemic unemployment expressed by overdoses in the inner cities and rural counties. On the one hand, the Great Resignation is an expression of this generalized pessimism. But the freedom to quit your job, that is, the freedom of formally uncoerced labor, could be the expression of optimism, and it is this optimism that is squandered when the Great Resignation is reduced to the racket mentality of collective bargaining. Assumed in this concept is labor as one interest group among many in a showdown of pure force that is mediated by the administrative state. Any Marxist should be aware that it was precisely this reduction of the socialist and communist parties of labor to mere interest aggregators that gave us the 20th century alliance of state, capital, and labor. Implied in collective bargaining is labor as an object of administration, not labor as a potentially global subject overcoming its own proletarian condition. The final three assumptions are crystallized in the left's rejection of the trucker protest as petty bourgeois or even proto-fascist in character. The second assumption is the attempted adjudication of who's working class or who's not. The fact that truckers, like Uber drivers or college students, take on debt in order to own and operate their own vehicles does not entail under the Marxist conception that they thereby own the means of production. Ownership of the means of production was for original Marxists a critical category that implied not sociological conflict, but a historical contradiction. We'll come presently to what that historical contradiction between living labor and capital actually is, but for now it's important to remember that for Marx, once proletarian industrialization and its correlate big monopoly capital takes off, every sector within the division of labor requires every other. It's not that oil rig or sweatshop workers produce more value than the sailors and truckers who transport these goods, or the financial data monkeys who allocate the surplus value to build the rigs and sweatshops in the first place. or the nurses who tend to their wounds and the teachers who teach their children, or the high school kids and low-wage workers who sell them the shoes and plastic goods via Walmart and Amazon. Marx is quite clear that once capital gets going, industrial capital presupposes commercial capital presupposes financial capital. No sector or link in the supply chain is any more real or fictitious than any other. All make up the total division of labor, which is now riven with a historical self-contradiction called capital. Adjudicating who's working class and who's not, as though class consciousness were a one-to-one transference from economic position to conscious interest, is what traditional Marxists called sociological reductionism or vulgar economism. Third, the trucker convoy is certainly petty bourgeois, but not because of its supposed class background, but rather because of the specific demand it poses, the restriction of state coercion. For Marx, at issue with the term petty bourgeois was not a sociological reduction, but a horizon of politics. All aims put forth under capitalism express and reconstitute petty bourgeois democracy. Whether we demand that bankers pay their fair share, or that the state curtail the violence of police and prisons, or that the state get out of the bedroom or our bodies, all of these democratic attempts to reconstitute bourgeois society necessarily get taken up by the state and perpetuate the self-contradiction of labor it embodies. For this reason, the Proletarian Party for Socialism would take up all democratic discontents and prosecute their contradictions. A socialist party would have, for example, dealt with people losing their jobs during the pandemic and nurses being severely overworked at once by facilitating the one toward the other, and without relying on the state to do so. At any rate, it is unwise to say the least for the left to support state suppression of the right to protest, regardless of what you think of the aims. Finally, it is assumed that only immediately economic demands can be politicized toward socialism. By contrast, Marx never ceased to point out how political demands can retroact upon the economic and politicize the economy per se. For example, when Ferdinand Lassalle dismissed the U.S. Civil War as a merely political dispute among bourgeois factions, Marx took this as a confession of his irrelevance. Indeed, for Marx, the global proletariat's political struggle for the Bill of Rights, the right to associate, publish, believe, and think, would itself lead the democratic struggle to politicize the economy. By safeguarding free speech and association, the Bill of Rights advances and protects the right of labor to transform its own conditions, the right of social forces to organize themselves in re-architecting social reality, to adjudicate destiny in an indeterminate fashion. A measure of the depth of the left's failure and regression over the course of the 20th century is the widespread notion that freedom itself is a right-wing value. These four assumptions boil down to the racket bargaining mentality of labor as a coalition group within the imperial state administering general austerity. So when the remainder of our time will undermine this shrunken conception by returning to the horizon of the mass socialist parties under imperialism and the meaning of the general strike they posed. Imperialism was the economic political form taken by the explosive second industrial revolution, the revolution in oil, steel, telegraph, and electricity. When you hear imperialism, the first thing you should think is not violence. Violence was the effect, not the cause of the deeper social historical contradiction driving it, at least according to Marxism. At the dawn of the 20th century, what Luxemburg and Lenin called imperialism was characterized by two facts: the organization of both living labor and scientific technological know-how in the form of the great industrial trusts of Rockefeller and Morgan, and the self-consciousness of that organization in the form of the mass socialist workers' parties. Only when both are present do you have a concentration of production. This concentration is not just literally workers clumped together, nor the mere technical, scientific, and organizational efficiency of mass-scale production, nor the fact that fewer and fewer workers were needed to generate increasingly massive productive capacity, but the potential embodied in all three of these together. And this potential is real only to the degree that it has historically self-conscious direction. This historical direction was given by the mass social democratic labor parties that were literally the living fuel of industrializing imperialism. What Rockefeller was doing by scaling out his oil competitors in Ohio and Pennsylvania was concentrating labor, its productive capacities. It was actually the division of labor acting through Rockefeller. He was merely the character mask. When Morgan brought together the industrial trusts onto a single board, all he was doing was allocating the surplus value extracted from the concentrated division of labor toward the further productive capacities opened up by it. Most of this capacity went to waste. The waste of not only living human, but also scientific technological capacity was directly tied to the potential of that surplus value. And that potential was embodied in the mass socialist party, the fact that labor was becoming conscious politically and historically of its own self-contradiction. Surplus value was for Marx a potentially conscious category. It was the workers' recognition that their degradation was directly correlated with the industrial capacities released by their labor. Was it raw dog-eat-dog competition and the struggle to survive that spurred technological innovation? Or, as Adam Smith proposed, was it the spontaneous division of labor itself? Only the historical bed of Marxism could answer this question because the spontaneous division of labor had actually encountered its own self-contradiction. The mass social democratic parties of labor aimed to realize the productive potentials of mass-concentrated labor. For this, only consciousness was needed. Supplanted for this consciousness were the sclerotic impulses of imperialism. What the general strike proposed was a jump from industrialization beyond imperialism to socialism. If all workers by their coordinated cooperation produce value, then stopping work tomorrow would immediately pose the question of society per se. Therefore, anarchists demanded it and trade union bureaucrats detested it. So, when in 1905 a general strike actually broke out in industrializing Russia, both anarchists and trade union bureaucrats were helpless to understand its historical significance. They both thought that a general strike was a technical instrument that could be wielded or not wielded as though by choice, from on high or from down below. What both sides missed was that history was repeating itself in a new and different way. What was new and different was the possibility of consciousness concentrated in the parties of labor themselves. The revolt of Russia in 1905 was the revolt of bourgeois Russia. They all decried the Tsar's imperial adventure against Japan, bankrupting the country without a conceivable goal. And yet this unanimous call against the Tsar, taken on its own political terms, soon split into the question of labor and capital itself. For Luxemburg, the failed revolution of 1848 was repeating itself in exactly the way that Marx had diagnosed. The political strike by bourgeois Russia, workers and capitalists alike, soon on its own terms split into workers against capitalists. Just as we don't know what the Great Resignation or the trucker convoy could have meant, we don't know what the mass strike in Russia could have meant. The difference is that the mass strike in Russia already presupposed a developed socialist party, whereas today, in the wake of its failure, any and all democratic discontents within capitalism are mere reactions to it that are hallowed by those seeking to run the bureaucratic administrative state, just as they're suppressed by it. Put otherwise, spontaneous work shortages today manifest from the common sense apprehension by workers that the degradation of their conditions can be traced to the release of the industrial capacities of their own labor. The difference is that while historically the existence of independent working class parties stood to advance the consciousness behind this apprehension, today work stoppages appear merely reactive and at a standstill. This political historical difference between having a party and not having a party committed to completing the revolution can be intuited in the meaning of mass-scale industrial technological labor organization itself. Why the trusts of Rockefeller and Morgan stand at a higher level of potential than the personalized platform capitalism of Apple and Google. What stands between them is the 20th century reaction to the industrial self-contradiction of the bourgeois revolution. Rather than labor realizing socialism by democratically overcoming imperialism, the imperial state was nailed down as the technocratic redistributive welfare state, maintaining labor populations at the expense of capital's own potential. We often think of high mid-century Fordist Keynesianism as directly planned production, particularly with the War Industries Board under Wilson that became the framework for New Deal state coordination. However, this state coordination of production by no means meant realizing the potential of concentrated production. In fact, it only centralized distribution and squandered the productive potential of big industry. Despite their ideological differences, bureaucrats in Washington and Moscow linked up production inputs and distribution outputs according to a more or less coordinated level of prosperity within their distributive fields and within the overall proletarian scheme of global labor. Just as the coordination by the state of military-industrial enterprises gave us the internet in the United States, so the coordination of breadlines by the Soviet bureaucracy gave us its final collapse. The administrative redistributive state of the New Deal and Stalinist democracy, in fact, squandered the potential of production, making both the internet as we now know it and breadlines necessary. This squandered potential is seen most clearly in the 1970s imagination of the electronic microchip revolution, which has been called a third industrial revolution. The reason why we cannot call the electronic microchip revolution a third industrial revolution is that the fundamental self-contradiction of labor expressed in the second was not overcome, indeed not even posed. The social question embodied in the Rockefeller and Morgan trusts could have entirely redefined possibilities for the individual. But because imperialism failed to be prosecuted toward socialism, collectivities and individualities got reified. Hence, with the electronic microchip processing, the entire productive capacity and potential of microprocessing would be dispersed among many supposed individual agents, each with a microchip in their own device, and through the compute power of that localized chip, supposedly realizing their own personality. Put otherwise, rather than pooling processing power into supercompute infrastructure shared by billions of users and capable of supporting high-end compute-hungry workloads, we scaled compute down in power consumption and affordability so that it could be distributed in 1 billion smartphones and 400 million PCs. The lowest common denominator jack-of-all-trades compute paradigm in neoliberalism was thus good for low-end consumer-oriented workloads like e-commerce, dating apps, casual mobile gaming, and influencer photo filtering. This is best encapsulated in Bill Gates' vision for a PC on every desk and Windows on every PC. Hardly a vision at all when considering the limitations imposed upon compute by the small-mindedness of everyone having to support their own workloads with the chips in their own device. Imagine the capacity that can be supported by each person running their own horse and buggy, compared to the capacity that can be supported by rail, which is shared infrastructure rented out piecemeal to businesses and households in the form of boxcars. Or each person with their own car versus a metropolis sharing a hyperloop, with each person renting out an automated box within that hyperloop. That's the difference between neoliberal personal computer paradigm versus post-neoliberal cloud data center infrastructure. Indeed, the 1970s neoliberal electronic microchip revolution was just a replay of the original neoliberal revolution of the 1870s. In the midst of the massive industrial potentials unleashed by large-scale industry, liberalism itself rejected Adam Smith and defined society per se as scarcity and diminishing returns. This is because Adam Smith's classical division of labor had historically fallen to and been taken up by the mass working class party for socialism itself. The historical potentials of large-scale concentrated industry was essentially socially and politically mediated. In a way, the OG neoliberalism of the 1870s already said we're all content creators operating on decentralized infrastructure, presuming a multiplicity of truths, as the only way to deal with the fact that history had objectively lost control. This, unlike today, was however, posed straightforwardly by socialism as the right of property and labor. Instead of this straightforward contradiction between the right of labor and the tools it released in alienated form, the suppression of socialism in the administrative, redistributive, and later austere technocratic welfare state, in fact represses the alienated potentials of large-scale industry. So, in neoliberalism, we can comprehend industrial potential only as personalized platform capitalism, and politics only as population management. In the 1992 film Barbarians at the Gate, Ron Johnson lives a happy life, having both satisfied employees and a fat enough kickback to transport his poodle on company dime across the continent. He manages a conglomerate of cookies and tobacco. When the barbarian at the gate, the privatizing loan shark Henry Kravis, approaches him to suggest taking the company private in a newfangled leveraged buyout, all that Kravis is saying is, cut the fat man and submit to the new reality of possibilities. The privatizing neoliberal loan sharks, the barbarians at the gate, were pounding on the bureaucratic doors of consumptive redistribution. The problem is not that neoliberal greed dismantled the comforts of Fordist Keynesianism, which insofar as it meant knowing everyone in your neighborhood and playing hockey on the street, also meant the good old boys club at Yale and in the boardroom. Rather, the problem is that when the comforts of Fordist Keynesianism were dismantled and social forces were unleashed, they merely reconstituted the small-mindedness of Pleasantville, only without the comforts, without the familiarity, without the ice cream. But through personalized compute, subscale internet startups, and good old boys clubs in the boardroom with different faces of racial and gender diversity. Platform capitalism is the small-mindedness of Pleasantville. Bezos is just as petty bourgeois in mindset as truckers, unionizers, and content creators, and it is appropriate that neoliberalism was spearheaded politically by the daughter of a shop owner, saying there is no such thing as society. It is only in the context of this global devaluation of labor, where the potential of production is supplanted as the administrative target goals of distribution, and where the failure of that production becomes austere, that the crisis of neoliberalism itself makes sense. The opium overdoses in Ohio are the same phenomenon as the sweatshops in Deng's China. Global supply chains were part and parcel of the global devaluation of labor. The productive potential of the electronic microchip was dispersed and disaggregated into mere distribution. The second industrial revolution had not reached its self-conscious completion. The future had already been spent. So when the accumulated failure of the 20th century reached its apex in the wage earners' revolt of Trump and Bernie, the left could only cry fascism, to be echoed just as soon by the right. Both missed what the deeper productive potentials were signaling beyond neoliberalism. The Roosevelt Institute itself cited the point of agreement in the supposed horseshoe between the progressive left and the populist right in the demand for onshoring jobs. Indeed, this is where Bernie and Trump agreed in their counterposed recognitions of neoliberalism that it was necessary to put Americans to work. The progressive left and populist right both celebrate Intel factories being built in Nevada and Ohio. The basic question underlying post-neoliberal capital is, how will labor be exploited, and to what end? The Great Resignation decries the drudgeries of endemic unemployment, meaningless work, and overwork. The trucker convoy decries the pretense of state power to manage it. No actual general strike is around the corner. It cannot be summoned at will. The question is whether a Marxist left will take up democratic demands by workers, not in order to attempt reconstituting the administrative redistributive state of the 20th century, but deeper toward completing the second industrial revolution in socialism.